Hello, historians. It's March 9th, 2021, and we have basically finished our study of the Civil War for the most part. There are a couple things that I want to talk about. One of them is the idea that Confederate generals, they basically took up arms against their nation, the United States of America. They did that in large part believing that they were in a new nation, that all of the Confederate states that had seceded were a new nation, the Confederacy. In reality, they were not a new nation, and within a few years, they would all be reconciled back into the United States of America. So these generals who took up arms against their country are guilty of treason. But interestingly enough, 10 of those generals ended up with U.S. military bases named after them. And you're like, wait, we named military bases after the losing generals? They lost and they committed treason against the United States of America, and we named military bases after them? How can that be? Well, the reason was that in the 20th century, with World War I and World War II, lots of new bases were added and they needed to be named. And so they gave the responsibility of naming those bases to local commanders. And so in the South, the local commanders often chose a general that either lived or fought in the region where they lived. And so these are all Confederate generals. So I just thought I would review these really quickly for you. Camp Beauregard in Louisiana, which is a National Guard base, is named after Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard from Louisiana, of course. Fort Benning in Georgia is named after Henry Benning, a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. Fort Bragg is named after General Braxton Bragg, and that's in North Carolina, not so far from where we live here in Virginia. Fort Gordon is in Georgia, and it is named after John B. Gordon, General John B. Gordon, who was a major general in the Confederate Army. Fort A.P. Hill is actually right here in our state in Virginia, near the town of Bowling Green. And it is, of course, named after General A.P. Hill. And Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas is named after John Bell Hood, who is actually best known for commanding a Texas brigade during the Civil War. Fort Lee, again, here in Virginia, in Prince George County, Virginia, is named after the head general of the Confederate Army, General Robert E. Lee. Fort Pickett, if you remember Pickett's Charge during Gettysburg, that is also here in Virginia. It's a National Guard installation, and it's named after General George Pickett, the general of the infamous Pickett's Charge. Fort Polk in Leesville, Louisiana, is named after Leonidas Polk, who is also known as the Right Reverend Leonidas Polk because he is an Episcopal bishop as well. He was an Episcopal bishop as well as a Confederate general. Fort Rucker is in Alabama, named after Edmund Rucker, who is a colonel who was appointed a brigadier general in 1864, but actually his promotion never was confirmed by the Confederate Congress, which just kind of disbanded not that long after he was appointed a general. So officially, he was never an actual official general, but he still has a base named after him. Then also Camp Pendleton. There are two Camp Pendletons. There's one, a National Guard base here in Virginia, and also an extremely large base out on the West Coast, Army base out on the West Coast, named after a Confederate Brigadier General named William N. Pendleton. So there are occasionally some flurry of activity. People want these changed. They don't believe that the losers should be honored by getting a base named after them. It means all these bases would have to be renamed. But of course, now we have many generals from World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam who could, and even since then, things that have happened that we've participated in, that they could have a base named after them. So it wouldn't be that difficult if the Army and Congress decides that should be done. So it's a question for you to just think about. Should we continue to honor the losing side in a war? The side that left the Union? This is the South, right? And there is sometimes some sympathy for the Confederacy. And, you all know that I was born and part of my life raised in California, but actually half of my life I spent living in the South. I can't remember if I told you this in another video, so if I'm repeating myself, oh well, that's how it goes. But, I've lived in Alabama and Texas and Virginia for those 3 states for half my life. And so I understand the Southern cause. Of course, like my parents were Californians, and I often identify that way because that's where I was born. And so where I went to college and high school and all that. But so I just want you to think about, should Confederate bases be renamed? Should Confederate monuments still stand? That's a very controversial question. And another controversial question is, should it be okay to fly the Confederate flag? And I know in this part of the world, in southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina and farther south, as farther south you go, the Confederate flag is considered a symbol of heritage, that this was our heritage. But I also just want you to remember that part of that heritage was the enslaving of other human beings. And you have to make your own decision. I'm not going to tell you one way or the other, but there are many people in the South raised, and I have known many of them since I moved here and started teaching history here, who feel very strongly that the Confederate flag is part of their history, part of their heritage. And that is certainly their choice to do that. We live in a free country and we are allowed to do that. On the other hand is people say, why would you fly a flag for the side that lost? Why do you fly a flag that represents people who left the United States and didn't want to be part of the United States anymore? Why? And so there's strong feelings and questions on both sides. So it's just something for you to keep in mind as you develop your own opinions and your own decisions. So the other thing I want to just really quickly review, now that we've come to the end of the Civil War and General Lee has honorably surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox, right here in Virginia, out in the western part of the state, Appomattox Courthouse. And General Lee was very honorable, and General Grant was very honorable in that. I'm going to tell you a little funny story about that comes from part of my family. I have an older brother and sister who have a different dad than I do because their dad passed away when they were extremely young, and my mom remarried my dad. And his name was Robert Ord. And there's a funny story that at Appomattox, first there's 2 funny stories. The first funny story is about the family that lived where the first Battle of Bull Run was fought. Well, that family that lived there, they said, we're getting out of here. We are not going to live here anymore. There's a war going on. We're going to move west, far west, to get away from this war and not be around this war anymore. And so they did. They moved all the way to Appomattox, Virginia. And at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, the Civil War ended at their house. They're the McLean family, and they moved from Bull Run, Manassas, to Appomattox Courthouse, and it was in their living room that the Civil War surrender papers were signed. And so it's just really crazy that the Civil War kind of started on their property and ended in their living room. So back to the other story about my brother and sister's dad. One of the generals there, not their dad obviously, but one of their ancestors was General Ord. And General Ord, there's a story that they tell when you go to Appomattox. I don't know if they still tell it, but they used to tell it. And of General Ord's behavior. And what he did is he told Wilmer McLean, I want to buy one of the tables, these small writing tables that were used to sign the surrender papers. I'll say, Grant or Lee, doesn't matter. I want one of these tables. And Wilmer McLean, recognizing that these are, now national heirlooms, refused him and said, no, you can't. I'm not selling them. And so almost immediately after the surrender happened, General Ord had his aide go inside, pick up one of those tables, tie it onto his horse, and General Ord rode away with this table. It was kept in the Ord family for many years until it was finally donated back. to a museum. So it's kind of a funny story of General Ord and Wilmer McLean, whose land the Civil War began and ended on. So the Civil War is done. Lincoln is assassinated, and Andrew Johnson becomes the president. And Andrew Johnson is very sympathetic towards the South. And so he has kind of a tumultuous period of his presidency where he passes laws and they're vetoed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in another video. But I just want to talk about life for the freed slaves, because the day that Lee surrendered to Appomattox, the slaves were free. And what was their life like? Well, there are a couple of things that were definitely hallmarks of post-slavery life. One of them was segregation. Segregation is the enforced separation of racial groups in a country or a community or a school or a place of business, where the races are segregated, okay? Another word that's important for this is disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement is to deprive someone of their right to vote. When you're disenfranchised, you cannot vote. All right, when you're convicted of a felony in the United States, you are often disenfranchised and have to actually make an appeal to have your voting rights returned after you serve your time. Another important thing to know about is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery in the United States in 1865, almost. The amendment includes a loophole regarding involuntary servitude, which is another way of saying slavery. You cannot be enslaved in the United States of America except as punishment for a crime in which you've been convicted of in a court of law. So prisons can hire men out to work for someone else against their will. All right, that still exists. You might have heard old-timey things like, if you've ever seen the movie Brother, Where Art Thou? The men in there end up on a chain gang. And a chain gang is a group of men put out to work to make money for the prison, chained together. And they usually wore, black and white stripes. So if they escaped, they'd be easily identifiable. So that is part of the 13th Amendment. Okay, and then the other word I want to talk about is lynching. Now, you should probably have heard the word lynching, and you probably just think, oh, lynching means they hang somebody. That's what a lynching is, but it's actually more than that. It's a form of violence in which a mob says they are going to administer justice. Or there's no courtroom and no trial. They are going to basically say you're guilty and execute the offender that they have declared guilty, execute them. That could be hanging. That was often meant someone was hanged, but not always. Sometimes it was torture or mutilation, cutting off parts of the body. And then sometimes it ended with a hanging. Sometimes it ended with a partial hanging. So it was basically a form of torture against largely Black American citizens. So that it were many of them, former slaves, of course. Occasionally it was a white person, but it was almost always a Black person. And sometimes it was a husband and wife, sometimes it was a whole family, sometimes it was children, sometimes it was women who were first raped and then possibly mutilated and then hanged. Sometimes, like I said, hanged almost till dead and then tortured. Lots of nasty stuff, okay? So a couple of things. You're going to get a paper on this with more details. I want you to know the term Jim Crow laws, which was basically laws that segregated and disenfranchised, which is both of those, in a formal legal system that actually dominated the American South for about 75 years, beginning in the 1890s. It affected almost every aspect of daily life. The schools were segregated, parks were segregated, libraries, drinking fountains, restrooms, buses, trains, restaurants. There were whites only and colored signs all around that constantly, made sure that this was enforced. I don't know if there are a couple of movies that you can kind of see this really clearly. One of them is a little bit older movie called Remember the Titans, where a young black high schooler and a young white high schooler become good friends and experience some of this Jim Crow. And the other one is Hidden Figures. If you haven't seen Hidden Figures, you should see it. It's a true story. It is about 3 women scientists, some of the first women scientists that help the American space program begin. Like, these women were amazing. But as this movie goes through their lives, they also experience this Jim Crow situation, not being able to get a book they need because it's only in the white library, then not the black library, and have to sneak into the white library and be rebuked for being in the wrong library. Having to, wanting to take courses, like post-college courses, graduate courses, and having to go to a judge to ask permission. From a black woman has to ask permission to go take those courses at night at the local black high school, where normally black students, or local white high school, where black students are not allowed. So I recommend that. Remember the Titans and Hidden Figures, excellent movies, both of them. So the other thing is the roots of the Jim Crow laws begin as early as 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And these black codes were what basically said where could formerly enslaved people work, how much could they be paid, and they appeared throughout the South as a way to kind of force black people to be in indentured servanthood to white landowners. They also took away voting rights, controlled where you could live, where and how you could travel, and also they could even seize children for labor purposes. Oh, another good movie to watch, Jackie Robinson. If you haven't seen Jackie Robinson with Chadwick Boseman, it is excellent, true story. Jackie Robinson went to my high school, by the way, back in Pasadena, California, and the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team asked him if he would be willing to join the all-white Dodgers team in the all-white Major League Baseball leagues to break the color barrier. And would he be able to do that and stand up for himself, but not respond to the terrible treatment that he would receive as the first black player in the white baseball leagues, because there was already a thriving Negro league for players that could not play in Major League Baseball. So another great movie, Jackie Robinson. So maybe I'll put that in the homework to recommend those movies if you have a chance to see them, because you should. They're really excellent, okay? So the legal system has been stacked against black citizens, and a lot of times in the South, former Confederate soldiers, they are the police and they are the judges, and so they make it really difficult for black people to win court cases, and made sure that they were subject to these black codes. They enforced the black codes. And these codes also were used in conjunction with these labor camps for men who had been put in prison, and they were basically treated as slaves. And in the South, statistics show that during this period, black offenders generally received longer sentence than a white person committing exactly the same crime. And then they were put to work. And often the work conditions were so grueling, they would die before they were ever released from prison. So it was pretty horrible. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. In the post-Civil War South, violence is on the rise, making danger just a regular part of being a former slave, an African-American person. Black schools would be vandalized. Sometimes they'd be destroyed, burned to the ground. There were bands of violent white people that attacked and tortured and lynched new American black citizens. Families were attacked. They were forced off their land. But the most ruthless organization of the Jim Crow era was the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, which began in 1865 in Pulaski, Mississippi, as a private club for former Confederate soldiers. The KKK became a secret society with its sole intention being to terrorize black communities. It seeped through white Southern culture with members at the highest levels of government, and also, the lowest back alleys where you'd find criminals. And I told you about the great cavalry general, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Unfortunately, Nathan Bedford Forrest was obviously a Confederate general, a very successful Confederate general, but he was one of the original leaders of the Klan, being from Tennessee and being a Confederate war hero. And so there you go. I wanted to give you some of those little facts before you watch the rest of the videos today. And that's it for now. And I will see you on video on Thursday. All right, bye for now.